Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zero Carbon Futures Pavilion hosted by the Clean Air Task Force. And welcome to our hybrid recorded panel / presentation. Afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A because a surprise panelist has been able to attend. So stick around, think of your questions during the presentation, and we'll have them come up at the end. So today we will hear about the current environment of energy modeling, the positives and negatives of using models in policy and decision making, as well as where they are headed, how they can be improved, and what are the best ways that we can engage with modeling results as we begin to decarbonize energy systems all over the world. My name is Mikenna Montgomery. I am an energy systems analyst on our energy systems analysis team, where we apply an interdisciplinary systems thinking approach to decarbonization analyses in order to ensure a just and feasible zero carbon future. One specific function of our team is to provide broad support to the research and advocacy efforts across the organization. And what I've learned is that punchy numbers and sophisticated figures are really effective in promoting progress in climate and energy policy. If you were to deconstruct much of the analyses that I've done during my time at CATF, you'd find that modeling outputs are at the root of those analyses. The models we use are called decarbonization models or energy transition models. These are the types of models that attempt to emulate the real-world energy system in order to provide insights into how all of the different moving parts and aspects of society interact with respect to the energy system. Sometimes they refer to the electricity sector alone, and sometimes they refer to the entire economy, including sectors like industry, agriculture, transportation, and buildings. Energy transition and decarbonization models have been incredibly valuable in providing the foundational evidence to support one of the reasons that we're all here, which is that we can and must mitigate climate change, the impacts of climate change, and slow global warming by altering the ways in which we produce and use energy. But the reason we create models is because the relationships that we need to catalyze this process are far more complicated than any human brain is capable of perceiving. And in creating these models, we begin to understand that many of these aspects and relationships are really difficult to capture numerically. Some of the most widely respected models that exist today have been crucial in helping us understand the systems that we're working with, and in doing so have accelerated funding and support for the various energy technologies that we need to decarbonize, including wind and solar. Yet actually implementing an energy system with a large share of variable renewable energy entails much more complexity than these resulting percentages are able to capture. Most of these models are categorized as techno-economic optimization models, in which scenarios are created from a set of parameters that define energy demand based on drivers like population, service demand, and energy efficiency. Constraints like resource availability and emissions reduction targets are applied to each of these scenarios, and then the model develops a portfolio of technologies by optimizing for a least cost pathway. The result is often something like a scenario that would lead to a net zero emissions with a large share of renewables by 2050. But as you can see, models that are created by different people or organizations, even if the end goal is the same, end in a wide variety of results. This is because creating a model requires the modeler to make certain judgment calls about how they think the world works. They have to make assumptions. And these assumptions have varying impacts on the outcome of a model. They may represent biases that aid in maintaining systemic inequalities, or they may rely on unpredictable actions occurring at unprecedented scales. Or they may rely on a prediction that could turn out vastly different than what was expected. For example, if the modeler assumes median population growth and low levels of economic growth in developing countries, the predicted global energy consumption will be much, much less than if the modeler were to predict high economic growth and high population growth in those countries currently consuming energy far below the OECD level. When our assumptions are biased and our highest priority is cost, the outcome of our modeling exercises often lead to an overconfidence and a small set of highly uncertain scenarios that will be unable to sufficiently serve every single person on the planet. In many of the most highly regarded analyses, like the one that informs this figure, we find that although the outcome might aim for sustainable development alongside emissions reductions, a large portion of the global population is left behind. So now the question is no longer, can we transition, but how do we transition? And how do we do so in a way that effectively confronts uncertainty and maximizes the benefit to society? How can we promote a future energy system that is equitable, resilient, and sustainable? We have to start thinking more deeply about the people piece of the puzzle. We at the Clean Air Task Force on the Energy Systems Analysis team believe that the future modeling efforts should leverage interdisciplinary, human-centered philosophy to drive a more holistic approach to how we decarbonize the energy system. So today, we will be hearing from experts who are working to develop and use modeling results more effectively. Modelers who are facilitating a shift in the narrative from techno-economic optimization towards a portfolio of solutions that allow people to explore the trade-offs throughout the decision-making process. Advocates that utilize a mixed method approach to ease the burdens of systemically flawed assumptions. Analysts that incorporate uncertainty to maximize social benefit and prioritize resilience for our future energy system. Researchers developing metrics that allow stakeholders to ensure their values are incorporated in the modeling and implementation exercises, as well as people that aim to build capacity of those traditionally left behind in order to reimagine an energy system that benefits all. So these are our speakers. Unfortunately, some of them are unable to attend today, but we are very fortunate to have a couple of folks who will be able to answer your questions at the end of this panel. We also were lucky enough to have 2 full hour-long recorded panel sessions that will eventually be posted on the COP27 CATF landing page, alongside a recording of this event and supplemental materials from the Energy Systems Analysis team. And so the first 2 speakers we will hear from today are modeling experts who are innovating the tools and methodologies in their fields. We first asked to learn a little bit more about these tools and methodologies and how they're utilizing them in their own work to address things like inequality and uncertainty. So I'm going to play a video, and bear with me, the sound might be a little fluctuating, but we're gonna do our best with what we got. So here we go.
One thing I would like to say is that I tend to be very careful to not get attached to a specific modeling toolset or specific types of methodologies, because that makes us into a thought process of selecting a hammer and finding nails to hammer with. But in general, with the policy analysis that we are doing, which traditionally uses scenario analysis, has some limitations. And I do think that having a broader uncertainty analysis techniques are having a more broad uncertainty analysis for policy decisions is important. So the tool that I have been recently using and also developing is the modeling to generate alternatives tool, which combines the computational capabilities that we have, which have increased exponentially in the last few years, with the social intelligence that I was talking about before. So in this case, we have the traditional energy system or power system models. They tend to have least cost scenarios that are developed. But in real world, the least cost scenarios are not the only ones that are implemented, right? There are many different objectives of many different stakeholders that we cannot directly put into our model. Because no matter how complex we make our model, they are always going to be a crude representation of a reality. So I have been trying to use the modeling toolset with a post-processing step that allows us to consider objectives of various actors in the system. So that one methodology has been especially useful in understanding the trade-offs in our system. And apart from that methodology, I have been working with stochastic programming and robust optimization to understand what would be the hedging strategies, given lots of different uncertainties in our system. Those tools have their limitations in the terms of there are only certain types of uncertainties we can model at a time. And if we do not model some type of uncertainties and focus only on a particular type of uncertainties, they have some bias. They create some biases in our results. So these type of methodologies need to be used very carefully, and we need to make the assumptions and the methodological framework very clearly available and documented. But those type of methodologies have been helpful in understanding uncertainties, lots of different uncertainties altogether in the models.
For me, in this space, I'm really excited about people impact assessments. And I feel like that's what I would call like the innovative technology piece of the modeling. I think that, as Dr. Patankar mentioned, there's a lot of, tools out there for uncertainty analysis in terms of like stochastic modeling, MGA to generate alternatives, right? But those often have been used for technical analysis, right? So there's uncertainty in wind resources, uncertainty in the solar resources, and we've spent decades developing those types of technologies. But one big uncertainty that I'm very concerned about is the people part. Right? Where are the people? How are the people going to use these technologies? What's the behavior, right? How do we integrate this behavior and identify the ways that people are using them? And did we expect people to use technologies the way that, we thought they would? And then for the decarbonization, are we seeing that the emissions, the co-pollutants, right? The local pollutants that we care about for PM emissions and SOx and NOx, are those also getting reduced as we would expect them to, right? Because we know that sustainability has a lot more in it than just greenhouse gas emissions. It also has those local pollutants, and where those things settle are going to lead to different local effects. And so, people impact assessment models, it is a big part, right? It's like a system analysis. And it's, within this, it's just like a subset of macro energy system modeling. But I have been working on some metrics. So, for example, we developed a new metric called the energy equity gap to evaluate energy poverty. And when we've tied this with regression analysis and using smart meter data, so at the household level, which is, I would say, kind of like a novelty and a new innovation, because with smart meters, we can have a more detailed look at how people are using energy within the home. And so we've shown for our use case in Arizona and in Illinois, in the United States, that low-income groups often wait between 4 to 7 degrees longer than high-income groups to start using their air conditioning units. Right now, this can actually show that they're putting themselves at risk of heat-related illness and heat-related death in the summer because they feel like they can't afford it. Now, on the other hand, in Illinois, we've actually seen this gap widen in the winter. So low-income groups are actually turning on their heating systems 8 to 10 degrees earlier than high-income groups, right? And so this actually can help reveal some inequities in terms of housing insulation, the cost to actually use these energy systems, which can then feed into our other models about climate adaptation, right? And like how that's going to impact, the amount of energy that people spend. And then this can also feed into larger models about demand response, supply and transmission grid planning, right? How much are these things going to cost, and how does that trickle down to the people? And so I think that the innovations in human behavior and trying to turn that into a mathematical model and feeding that into the mathematical models is super important, because that is something that I think that we're missing when we are trying to use these models to determine how to build out our systems.
Just a small comment there. I completely agree with what Dr. Nock is saying. Energy system models and power system models as well, they have become very good at understanding the parametric uncertainty, like uncertainty in cost projections or demand uncertainty, or even weather uncertainty. But the structural uncertainty, like the constraints and feedback loops that Dr. Nock is mentioning, is a big part that is missing with energy system and power system models, which needs to be researched further.
So both Dr. Patankar and Dr. Nock mentioned how we are beginning to confront uncertainty and using tools like modeling to generate alternatives, and how even when we begin to start thinking about a broader decision space, we can only model some uncertainties at a time. This may lead to integration of certain biases or unintended feedbacks. So then we ask the speakers to further explain how we might approach these issues and improve the transparency of what these issues might be and what would be causing them.
So there are a few things we as a modeling community can do. And first of it is making sure that the modeling assumptions are very well documented. And when we write a paper using certain methodology about a certain policy, we don't say statements like, please be careful about the modeling assumptions while interpreting the results. And instead, be very concrete about what type of assumptions we have made and what potential impacts that can have on the end use results. Because when we make statements like, be careful about this modeling assumptions, people who agree with that modeling output tend to disregard those type of warnings, I would say. And people who disagree with the modeling output tend to exaggerate those type of caveats. So being very clear about what type of assumptions you have made, documenting them very clearly, I would say is the first step in improving the transparency of the models. And the second thing I would say is if involving the decision makers or stakeholders into a modeling framework from the very beginning of your study, instead of at the end, where think that your modeling or the output of your modeling result is very different from what is happening in the real world or the real world constraints. So including the stakeholders and decision makers from the very beginning and making sure that your models are communicating well with them is one of the steps to ensure that there is a transparency in the modeling methodologies.
Yeah, so I'll just second everything that she said. And then also adding to that would be to make sure that we're involving both the policymakers and the community stakeholders, the community leaders, right? Because ultimately these things will impact them. And so when we are, asking ourselves, well, how will these benefits and costs translate down to the people? How will different people be impacted by this or accepting of these policies? Given what we're seeing, I think that can be a big part of it. And then on the communication piece, I think that's a huge challenge, right? Because people want the tagline. They want the Twitter post, right? I mean, in the Twitter, social media world, people want you to tell them the main result in 180 characters. And after that, I mean, people start to tune out. I've even seen where, my research paper, I mean, it's like 6,000 words plus a supplemental info. And then people remember the one tagline of low-income groups wait to turn on their ACs 4 to 7 degrees longer than high-income groups. And I'm like, okay, you forgot that we did that in Arizona and we did that in Chicago. And we did not look at all these other places like that we need to understand because we didn't have data there. And so caveating it, right, is something that needs to be done. But at the same time, people just want the information that they're going to use. And all the other stuff is like, well, okay, but I still am going to only use this piece. And so I think that can be a big challenge, right? And so it's really on the person who's trying to implement the policy, right? Trying to take, the modeling, scoping that different, organizations have done and digging into those limitations, assumptions, the way that they built the model and all the assumptions that they made to understand, okay, well, now that we're actually going to get to the point where the rubber meets the road, what was actually going on in this modeling. And I think that, the transparency is a big piece, but making sure that people are working with the modelers doing this work to figure out the practical implications and the practical way to actually implement these things is going to be big, which is why we need the stakeholders and community leaders there. On the other side, I also think that the modeling community has to be very good at talking in the language of others, right? So saying we're going to use an optimization model to do XYZ, I mean, people tune out when they hear the word optimization and model, right? And so, you know, it's not too much different to say we're going to use an electricity planning model that's going to determine, you know, where to retire different power plants, right? And that's what we're doing with some of these optimization models, right? And so getting at the plain English way to communicate these results, I think can help us go really far. One recent example is when I saw a model that was trying to estimate how the electricity rates would change. So electricity rates are the dollar per kilowatt hour that people pay. And I actually had to point out to this modeler that nobody cares about the electricity rate. They only care about their monthly bill. So if you tell them what their electricity rate is, they're not really going to understand if that's a good or a bad thing, because most people have no idea the dollar per kilowatt hour that they pay right now. And it's funny because I went to some utility companies and even some of them didn't know the rate that they paid, right? But they do know how much their monthly bill costs, and that's what they care about. And so making sure that the modeling and the sensitivity analysis is communicated in the way that people understand and communicated with the variables that they're actually making decisions on is going to be very important. So saying that the monthly bill could increase by 5%, and you know there's an uncertainty bound on this, like plus or minus 10%, that's going to be much more valuable than saying, well, the utility rate could increase by this, and the transmission cost in the area could increase by this, because most users at the household level have no idea what that actually means for them on a daily basis. And I think that will be really important too.
One more thing I would like to add to this discussion is that one good thing that is going on with the energy modeling community as such is that there's a very big push for open source models and open source data. After 2010s, I would say, because before that, there were just 2 energy system models that were open source, the Osmosis and MOA. And now I see that there are more than 17 power system models and more than 14 energy system models that are openly available to public. Now, to learn how to use those models is still a very steep learning curve, and not all of these models are very, very well documented. But having something that anybody can look into if they're willing has been a very big positive point with the energy modeling community. And we don't have to solely rely on the black box models that used to exist back in the day. So that's
yeah,
great.
I agree with that. And I agree with more open source data coming online and open source publications, right?
Yeah.
Because even if people don't have the time to learn the open source models, I mean, having access to the publications and what people are saying and being able to compare the results of people that use different models, I think is really nice that there's this big push also for open source as well.
So apologies for the quiet sound. I promise the full-length videos will be posted online. So if you couldn't hear, you'll be able to hear in a later recording. But so even as we try to improve the transparency around the methodology and assumptions and engage a wider range of stakeholders to include community members and policymakers, there are still elements of these integrated systems that we're trying to model that we can't capture. So next we will hear from a group of experts who translate results to inform policy, and who also work on modeling and analyses that incorporate typically underrepresented groups into the conversation. So we asked them to describe the benefits and limitations of utilizing quantitative results to address inherently qualitative issues.
So I think that quantitative answers are important, especially in to make short-term decisions and to evaluate whether to come up with concrete plans for a particular sector. And it's more useful for short-term targets, to set targets to see if you're going to meet them. And the longer-term models, you need to start capturing some of these qualitative aspects, because they, even if they're not, if you're not able to use a number to put in today, it is something that you kind of keep in mind, because it increases the uncertainties around different scenarios that you create. So just go back to my systems thinking, modeling, the methodology. So we first make a whole map of the system, which includes all kinds of causal relationships, things that we can quantify and things that we can't necessarily quantify. A lot of the qualitative aspects are also, you can put numbers to it. I mean, people are measuring happiness and stuff, but if you can even identify which are these parameters that will increase something or decrease something, even the direction of change, even if it's not a quantitative number for how much it's going to increase by or decrease by. Those things kind of help us understand the system that we're working with, and you try to kind of see what are these policy leverage points that will bring about the most positive change that you are looking for in that sector. So that's kind of how we're dealing with incorporating both qualitative and quantitative aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right with the question about, some aspects of how people's experiences cannot be captured by models. I mean, so for me being in the US, I work with communities that are dealing with environmental justice, who are dealing with a history of environmental racism, right? So they've been dumped on for generations as it relates to dirty fossil fuel infrastructure. In my opinion, if you're going to address these issues of thinking about climate change and vulnerable populations in the US context, you have to talk about racism. So racism relates to extraction of fossil fuels, racism relates to transport of fossil fuels, racism as it relates to processing of fossil fuels, racism as it relates to combustion of fossil fuels in this country. And so how are we going to capture in a model this intergenerational damage, poisoning of communities, right? That to me, I think it's a difficult thing to capture. You have to have a mixed methods approach, a more qualitative approach. And so you can only your models are only going to take you so far, in my opinion. So that's why I think even the social cost of carbon, for example, I think it's a good first step. But with stuff that I'm talking about, how are you getting at the cumulative impacts, right, of these social stressors, the cumulative impacts of the intersectionality of the social, chemical, biological, ecological stressors that folks deal with? How are you going to take into account the multiple stressors associated with the various climate-related perturbations in the context of this racism and structured poverty? I'm a little skeptical that models can adequately capture that. So, in my opinion, you have to have a mixed methods approach. The model can take you so far, but you need other types of efforts, modalities to really get to the answer that we need to be getting to when it comes to mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and also equity, and all those things, as I said before.
Yeah, this is such an important question. I think there's a quote that's sometimes overused, but I think it has a really fundamental truth: is that all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think that there's this, there are at least two or three things for which you can't replace a model for. If we had the intellectual capacity, we could do all of this on the back of an envelope. But we really don't understand just intuitively what the impacts are of investments in one part of the economy through an economy, and what those distributional effects may or may not be, and so on. And so there's a fairly complicated system in the background that we have to unpick as transparently as possible and represent that. So there's one bit of this where we need models to help us think through the system that we're trying to work with. There's another bit, and that is that if we're going to be releasing funds, whether they're from the the national budget or concessionary finance, we do a lot of work with least developed countries and so on. There's an element of sort of due diligence and transparency, and we need to move into some sort of quantitative motivation for why it is that we pick one route over another. So there's this quantitative aspect that's important for at least two pieces of the puzzle. I think there's another bit that's really important, and that is that models, in fact, help us to have a conversation. And I personally think that is incredibly important. That conversation can be between government ministries. Often it's the case that the finance ministry will be effectively servicing a set of other infrastructure ministries and understanding where best to allocate its limited resource is really important. And a model helps us to be able to articulate the relative impacts. And I think, and this permeates through to different stakeholders. These can be folk on the ground in the community, or they can be externals, internationals with whom folk are engaging, in processes as large as the IPCC. I think there's something really important though that was touched on by the last speaker, and that is that a lot of the models that we have, I mean, there are models out there that do this, but a lot of the models that we have don't really help us to unpack whether or not we're evaluating interventions that allow us to look at inclusive growth. The last speaker spoke about structural injustice in a developed country context, which is really important. We do a lot of work in various parts of Africa where women, for example, will spend 4 to 8 hours with children collecting fuel wood. And again, this is a sort of a really deep structural problem. And to be able to understand how we're going to affect people's livelihoods in a way that is deeply meaningful to create, productive opportunities or other things are things that we can capture in models. We've been very bad at capturing them in models. I would suggest that trying to understand some of the legacy impact with respect to historical injustices is going to be, it's one of those difficult things. I think it's really important because it's very real, especially in context of decarbonization, where we see a lot of least developed countries looking for a path to develop, to lift their populations out of poverty, and they're well within their carbon budgets. At the same time, this push and stress to reduce emissions. I think there's an important space there for models to help us unpack sort of growth opportunities that release some of the shackles of the social problems that we've inherited, that just allow for growth and do so in a way that reduce emissions at the same time. And I would say there's an urgency about that as well.
I think the first thing we need to do is to make it clear what the models do, what the scenarios do, and what they don't do. And this is not known outside the modeling community. So and it's not known for the policymakers. So for example, we have the integrated assessment models, which are the models that are usually used in the IPCC report. These models do not capture at all the injustice, the historical responsibility, and they are all based, and they don't even capture all the demand side measures that would reduce emissions. And they do not include at all except one scenario that includes convergence between the global north and the global south in the access to modern services. And then they do come up with a decarbonized system with carbon capture solutions, with these unproven technologies by the end of the century, and this starts from 2050. But all this and the assumptions behind that are not known to policymakers. So that's why they are currently, these scenarios and these models are misleading policymakers. And for me, the first step is to make this known, to make what is behind these models. They can exist, but they should exist in parallel world, not in our world, because in our world, we cannot deliver on climate emergency, we cannot deliver on the climate justice, and we cannot deliver on development issues with these scenarios. So for me, these scenarios, but they are considered today as a reference scenario, and this is what is wrong. Because what is behind these scenarios and what they do is not known, because it's very complicated, it's very complex for someone who is not a modeler or someone who does not play the role that I play, the bridge between modeling and policy making. So it's very difficult to understand. So if you could help us to make this known, that would be good. And then this should put pressure on the modeling community to either, I don't think this modeling community could change, could evolve. I don't believe on that. So what I do believe on is that we need a different modeling framework, and we do need a different modeling community that considers all these issues. And we do need, because this modeling community is dominated by people from the north, from Western countries. So it's just a mess. It's like 2050 in terms of population will not be dominated by Western countries, but 2050 projections are made by people from Western countries today. So there is something that is fundamentally wrong in these scenarios and in these models. And we cannot fix that. So the only option that I see is to do something different, and then we leave them in their parallel world, and they can continue to play with their scenarios. That's fine, but we need something else.
So again, the path to developing these groundbreaking models that has led us to understand that we can decarbonize the economy, but the question remains, how do we actually make it happen? Our experts have outlined many of the crucial pieces we as a research community need to understand about modeling and energy transition. So now we ask, what do those who are actually implementing these transitions need to know when applying these modeling results to advocacy and policymaking?
So there are 4 things that I personally keep in mind when making or using a model for a particular type of a problem. And the first is to focus on a problem instead of the methodology that you have available, and or the analysis tool that you have available. And I personally have been through this trade-off quite a few times, where modeler has a tendency to use a convenient modeling methodology that they are used to instead of, and then finding a problem that fits best with that methodology. So overcoming that comfort zone with the modeling tools and focusing really on a problem and then deciding what type of tool we should use for answering that question has been really helpful, or should be one of the priorities when using these models. And the second one is, whenever we create a model, especially an open source model and open source database, it's very important to set some procedures to ensure a quality of the data or quality of that model. Because oftentimes multiple people keep using this model, and if there is some small error or bias in an input data set or error in the model, that gets propagated through various different scientific publications. And that has to be so just ensuring the quality of data and the accuracy of the models is one of the, again, the more important aspects of modeling. The third thing is, I personally strive to be as transparent as we can be when publishing a particular study, and just making sure that the data that you're using is very well documented. The model that you're using is well documented. If somebody wants to replicate it, they should be able to replicate it without too much of a stress about fretting over what this particular terminology means, or how a particular constraint is formulated. So maintaining that transparency with all of the scientific publications is one of my personal goals. And the last thing that is a trade-off between complexity of a model and the uncertainty analysis that you require. So the goal is to keep the model as simple as possible and as complex as necessary, and which would let us answer a particular problem while considering lots of different uncertainties that are associated with it. So maintaining that trade-off is also one of the main goals.
I think that modelers are really good at telling you everything that's great about their model and about the pathway that is the most optimal. But I would challenge people who are modeling it and different advocacy groups to ask, who is the worst off in this pathway? And how does that compare to where they are right now? I think that if we are working towards better modeling tools, trying to incorporate different customer behaviors, right, different behavior of citizens, and different pathways, and trying to understand those trade-offs, asking who the worst off person or group or just segment of the population is can actually help us reveal some of the potential inequities and try to account for those. And then I would advocate for using multiple metrics for evaluation. And so there has been a ton of discussion on greenhouse gas emissions, but every system has trade-offs, every pathway has trade-offs. So understanding greenhouse gas emissions, the co-pollutants, how those translate down to different vulnerable groups in the population and how that impacts them. Water consumption, land use, right? There's a lot of things that we care about. And in order to do that trade-off evaluation for those different scenarios, we need to think holistically, because, a lot of people's lives are impacted by the energy system in multiple ways. So I would also encourage us to do that when we do our energy poverty evaluation, to not just stick with energy burden. It is a very important measure, but it's only one measure of how people are interacting with the energy system. There's energy equity gaps, there's disconnections, there's, the minimum energy consumption that we think that they would need, right? So there's a lot of things there. And then I think in the broader sphere of using these energy models to do the transition, I would just encourage people to not stop at the modeling, but follow up on the evaluation, right? So modelers have to work with the advocacy groups, have to work with the people actually deploying these technologies to understand what are the walls and gaps in being able to actually accomplish these energy transitions. So for example, Dr. Tony Reams had shown that in some parts of Michigan, certain income groups were not able to get LED light bulbs in their areas, right? And so that's a huge thing. I mean, in the United States, there are certain households that can't even get energy efficient light bulbs to put in their households, right? And we're thinking, oh, well, if people are just going to switch to incandescent, then we're going to have a lot less energy demand, but they still can't even get them, right? There's a lot of demand for electric vehicles. And in the United States, we haven't even been able to fill that demand. I mean, I heard that the backlog for Tesla alone is like 3 years, right? It's huge. And so even if we were trying to incentivize people to want electric vehicles, can't get them, right? You're waiting for a very long time. And so asking, well, what's the barrier to reaching these goals? And how can we make sure that we are tackling those barriers, both in understanding how this impacts the energy transition. Okay, now let's integrate it into the model and understand how this actually will hinder our ability to reach our goals. What should we be incentivizing? And then meeting with the practitioners who are actually doing this to understand, okay, do you guys have all the tools and resources in place to actually accomplish these things? And if they don't, then feeding that back into the model to understand how that leads us to affect how that affects our ability to reach these goals. So I think that there needs to be, more talking across all these different groups, and that's how we can really work together better to reach our equity and sustainability goals, and hopefully reach a just energy future.
So all of our experts in both groups have talked about bringing in these other perspectives of all of the people who are going to be affected by our changing energy system. But when you actually think about how many people that is, you realize that the task is much easier said than done. So now we ask, how can the modeling community attract and engage a more diverse set of perspectives?
Thank you. And again, this is just really critical. So what can we do next? I want to pull, so our focus is very much on LMICs and low-income countries in particular. And one of the things that we set up is something that we call the Sustainable Development Modeling School and Energy Modeling Platform. So what we do is that these are open schools, and we train about 100 people in around about 4 schools per year in different parts of the world. And these are either government analysts or young academics that are building capacity in their country to be able to undertake the kind of modeling exercise that's required to develop these long-term national strategies, and to help release some of the funding and financing that's required. It's the case that we make the entrance requirements for these schools really quite high. Folk have got to come along with letters from their deans or higher if they're from university, or from secretary generals or higher if they're from country governments. And the thing that is incredibly humbling and interesting is that these schools are always oversubscribed. We have to limit the number of people that come to the schools. There's a function of the funding that we're able to get from our partners in these particular efforts. And the international organizations I mentioned a little earlier on all contribute. Inter-American Development Bank, World Bank, IRENA, International Energy Agency, International Atomic Energy Agency, and GIZ, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and others. But frankly, it's not enough. It's the case that I think it's really important that not only do we need to get the sort of ecosystem of tools and elements set up sensibly so they can scale, but we need to scale, and we need to think carefully and sensibly about how to scale. How can we make this stuff more accessible to folk than is the case right now? And it's a little bit heartwarming. I'm digressing a bit. In the modeling platform that we ran for Africa, we had some absolutely brilliant African champions. We're resource constrained. We're looking for resources to help set these schools up and grow them. And we had a couple of volunteers from Kenya take part as trainers in the first Latin American modeling school just a couple of weeks ago, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful to see this sort of South-South interaction. And at the schools, we make sure that we try very hard not to develop models for other countries and talk about the outputs, but to create the pieces that we can work together and empower people to develop those outputs together. And something that was sort of heartwarming was just to see South-South empowerment. And to be honest, I think this is something that we need to see more of, and we need to think about a structured way of doing this well. And on the one hand, there's this sort of importance of creating this massive community of practice. On the other, I think it's absolutely critical that this is based on the best available science, data, information, methods, and processes. And so the other challenge I see is that we need to work on the sort of science policy interface, so to speak. But I think maybe we go a bit further. It's the society science policy interface, and to be able to structure that in a way that it's accessible, that we can build into. Because again, this little piece of the global puzzle, I think, has been not as accessible, let's say, as it could be, and it needs to grow faster and better.
Yeah, I think it's been said really well by the other speakers. I can maybe just, so I think in terms of the modeling philosophy, to not focus on minimizing or maximizing something for it to if the objective is to simulate real world as it is, so then your objective as a modeler and the communities that you engage with is also just about understanding all the causal relationships, rather than you're trying to make this model into this calculator that gives you a particular result, and you've maximized utility, minimized cost. So I think having the objective is to just be able to simulate what's really going on, and so you're trying to just find out more than trying to answer. So in fact, the famous quote that Mark spoke about, all models are wrong, but I think some can help ask the right questions, and that itself would be a pretty good success for a model.
So I like the example that I think it was Mark who has given this about India is doing some great work, but what about Togo or any other small country in developing world? These countries are completely absent from this developing from this modeling community. And this is something we must work on, because we cannot, first, we don't capture, even today, we don't capture what's going on in these countries. We don't capture how these countries may evolve. So you need national experts to do that. You need, we need to get from this first the Western and bottom-up approach to modeling to more worldwide or the planet modeling and bottom-up planet modeling, because otherwise you cannot capture a lot of things. I am expert in building policies, and there are two options for, we know that most of the buildings will be built in developing countries and emerging economies. So the global south, let's say the global south. And then what we do, what you will find in all the models and the scenarios is that they just do projections based on the way we build in the north. But the way we build in the north is disaster. It's already disaster. So can you imagine if we have to build billion of square meters that we need to build, that must be built in the rest of the world, because people do not have houses. So in the same way, it's a complete disaster. And in these countries, fortunately, there is still knowledge on how to build differently. There is still knowledge on how to have a good life, different from what has been sold to us as a good life, which is in reality a nightmare today. But and this is not at all captured. To capture this knowledge, and it does not even exist in scientific publications. Why? Because you have the standards for scientific publications, again, is set by this international community. We call it international. We should actually stop calling it international community. We should just call it Western scientific community. And it set the standards based on the way we do things. I am from both sides, so that's why I feel very comfortable saying these things. And then if you are not from this Western scientific community, try to have your paper published somewhere in a good journal. No way. And in addition to that, usually in these countries, they don't have even the resources. So I was surprised. I was in the IPCC process as Algerian and French, but I am based in Paris. So it's very funny to be counted as Algerian when you are based in Paris and you have access to scientific databases, etc. And but we had African colleagues who are Africans based in Africa. They did not have access to the same databases. How would you balance? How could you expect that you could have an expert, the brightest scientist from Africa, who would come to go to Imperial College or to go to IASA and discuss the modeling assumptions? How could you imagine that this could happen? It's impossible to happen. And these are the things, the inequality starts here. And if we do not fight against these things, so we will just be turning around with the same people, or with people like me, mixed from both sides, with one leg in Africa, one leg in Europe, but we cannot change the world like that. And we are going nowhere like that.
Yamina, following Yamina and Mark's great examples, I think just to say that my colleagues who are more experienced in this modeling space, they bring some really important points about, Mark talked about empowerment, right? I use the term, Mark, I-empowerment, not E-empowerment, because the whole idea about I-empowerment, some people connect to the power they already have. So we always talk about the empowerment. So how we build capacity and empower folks to do more of this. And that's what y'all are both saying. That's what all the panelists are saying about empowering folks who are the experts on these issues to be in these spaces, right? And Yamina said we have to create another space. The current space is broken, right, Yamina? It's exclusive. It's otherizing, right? It's colonial. You cannot have that kind of approach when you're talking about climate justice. It is at its heart fundamentally unjust, right? So the whole thing needs to be reset. Basically, that's what Yamina is saying. Mark gave a great example of the schools, and I like to, piggyback off Mark's example of, you got to do that empowerment, like Mark said, build those schools up so you have these modelers and they work together because they have a similar context, and that's empowering. Right. And then Yamina made a really good point about, ground up. We talk about it in the EJ space. It has to be grassroots and dirt roots. It has to be bottom up. It's not going to work, whether it be a U.S. context with climate justice, right, or a global context with climate justice. It has to be bottom up. It's actually more effective, more efficient when it is bottom up. It's a better use of resources too, y'all, when it is bottom up, because contextualized. Each model, the model has to come from that country, right? It has to be based on that context. A model that is not, the assumptions and data doesn't, it's really interesting that, we're having this conversation, because I think in the same way, I talk about the Human Genome Project, there needs to be a whole ELSI framework as it relates to climate change modeling. Like the whole legal, ethical framework. Like, where's that committee? Where's that oversight board? Where's the input of countries who are really suffering now from climate change and who are going to be suffering from these poor models and poor scenarios? Where's their voice in pushing back on these models? That needs to be integrated. So we need systems change. I know Yamina talked about systems change. We need systems change within this system, right? And that has to be part of this COP27 conversation. And that has to be, as I mentioned before, there needs to be many COPs in every country, because that makes it, again, more ground up, bottom up. So I don't want to repeat what others have already more articulately said, but I agree with Mark's examples. I agree with Yamina's powerful statement. And I just think that, just to close, that communities' voices have to be at the center, as I said before, And we have to move away from this colonial, extractive, exclusionary, otherizing system that we currently have, where the experts are Western experts and not experts. I'm not saying you this problem having some Western experts, but the folks who are most impacted, they have to be driving this work. And that would be my closing comment for that question.
I don't think, I repeat again, I don't think with the existing modeling community, we could make this change of the system. So I do believe that we need something different, parallel to what exists, something that is more inclusive, something that considers the South, where the South has a voice, because today the South does not have a voice. The South does not have voice in any. It's like in the political discussion. It's like when you have the UN discussions. It's really the scientific community reflects what's going on in the UN, but people do not see it because we are hidden in our offices. So you see, if there is an UN decision, where is the voice of the South? It does not exist. And it's exactly the same in the modeling community. So with this, I leave you, and I hope we could make this revolution all together.
It's not often that we speak about transformation this way with respect to the more technical aspects of energy transition. But if this is the only way that we can get the IPCC models and other modeling efforts ahead of COP28 to prioritize just and resilient energy systems, then I'll just finish by echoing Dr. Saheb's call to revolution. And so now I'd like to invite Leslie Abrahams and Mark Howells to the stage to have a conversation and answer some questions. I'll sit over there. Oh, okay. Are you sure? Okay. All right. So with some background music, the first question I'd like to ask is for both Leslie and Mark to describe a little bit about the work that they're doing and the visions they have for some of the modeling efforts and changes they're trying to make in this space. So I'll pass it to Leslie first.
Hi, I'm Leslie Abrahams. I'm the Director of the Energy Systems Analysis Team at Clean Air Task Force. And our work drives to change how we use models to make decisions and policies around energy transition. And so when we think about how energy models are used and what their purpose is, it's to help us make decisions. And so when we want our decisions to be focused on the people. So number one, we need to make humans the center of our models. Number two, we want our futures to be resilient. So we need to incorporate risk into our models. And so that includes thinking about the scenarios that we use. Scenarios are just stories that we tell about the future and how our world is going to change, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is that we are bad at predicting the future. And so we need to make sure that our models represent the resilience that we want in our changed energy system. And number three, we want our models to show us how to make progress. So it's not just enough to say that there's an endpoint that we are working towards. We need to make sure that endpoint is feasible and effective and that we know how we can get there. So the work in energy systems analysis at Clean Air Task Force is changing the way that we use models to make those decisions.
Thank you very much. So my name is Mark Howells. I'm a professor at Imperial College London and Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. There are some things that I think are critically important. There is a large amount of finance being mobilized right now to transform the energy sector. We were talking with the Green Bonds Initiative just the other day, and they have trillions of dollars that are waiting to be invested into the energy sector. At the same time, governments have got this obligation to develop policies, as we heard earlier on, that need to be consistent and coherent across departments and something that governments can manage. We also have businesses and behavior. We've got people and businesses on the ground. Something can make great economic sense, it can make great policy sense, but if it doesn't fit into people's lifestyles and cultures, if it doesn't fit into business models so people can make money out of it, it's not going to work. And then finally, we're trying to transform the energy system into something that's got a lot more renewables in it, much more intermittent. We have new technologies that create all kinds of value propositions and opportunities. And it's the case that we, to understand where all of these go, at the heart of each one of these, you need a model. So it's critical that these models are right. And if any country wants to be able to develop and plan out its future, understand where the finance goes, understand where the policies go, understand how to interact with society and business, and to make sure these are technically capable, they need to have the capacity to do that. Right now, they don't. There are all kinds of barriers. We heard earlier on about data not being available, or if it is available, is it of a good enough standard? We've heard about issues to do with the models themselves. Is it the case that you take something off the shelf and it's fit for what you want to do? Or is it something that's, you know, been applied elsewhere and you're just trying to do what you can with what you've got? And then there's all of the stuff in and around upskilling. I mean, can you go online right now and do a simple course on how to do energy modeling? Like, what are the things you need to take into account? And how can you contact the people out there that are doing technical assistance? So we really need a change in this ecosystem. And some of the work that we're doing, and we're partnering with others under a program called the Climate Compatible Growth Program, funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK, with a set of universities over there, and absolutely open to partnership. You know, these are the bottom of the UK's universities. So we've got Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, and UCL in there. But we also have universities like the Open University to take the knowledge that's made and try and make it accessible, and then to partner with folk to improve that. One of the advances, there are a couple of things. I'm quite passionate about this, so I could talk for too long. But there are a couple of things that I think are important, going back to the modeling themselves. So we've developed a model generator. So it's not the model that you take off the shelf. It's something that will help you develop a model that's fit for purpose. So whether it's in Togo or Trinidad or, you know, Tokyo, you can use this model generator to think about how to develop the model that you need. And I think that's important. And then the other thing, we've started to develop starter data kits. So for something like 70 low-income countries right now, you can get a starter data kit to start your analysis that's good enough. And it's good enough to do analysis where you can go to the GCF or other funders to say, look, we've got a bunch of projects. We think that these are worthy of financing. Can we apply for readiness funds to make them bigger? Every country in the world has about $1 million set aside just for readiness funds. But a lot of governments are just not in the place to ask for what they need to understand what projects are going to be good for them in that space. So extremely keen to partner to trying to develop an ecosystem. But as we said earlier on, you know, something that's quite carefully thought out and structured. So something that can scale fast, much like an app on your phone. Once you've got that app, there are all kinds of things you can do. You can apply it, but you can also do updates and other things. And you don't necessarily need to know all of the super technical stuff in the background, but it is perhaps one way of several of kind of getting things out there. So some of those methods would be helpful, and to design them together, I think, would be great.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think talking about this ecosystem of modelers, analysts, and researchers and developing these tools to help people better understand what they're dealing with is really important. And so I think one of the efforts that the Energy Systems Analysis team is trying to help lead and build a coalition around is developing more tools that allow, you know, people who don't engage with models, don't engage with analysis, aren't math people, for example, have the opportunity to engage with some of these outputs and results that allow them to make decisions and allow them to think about what, you know, their energy system might look like in the future and how it might affect them. And so I think I'm really happy to have you here, Mark. I think these are all great points, and obviously Leslie. But I'm going to open the floor to any questions. If you have any questions, raise your hand, and I can bring a microphone along. Or Kyle will bring the microphone to you. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, if not, I have some more questions that I can ask. So I'll give it a couple seconds, and then... All right, I'm going to ask some more questions. So when we're talking about bringing in these folks, and I know, Mark, you said in the video, you talked a lot about how you have these schools where you bring in modeling students from these developing countries. what are some of the methods, or what are the strategies that you have to kind of bring these people in, and how do you find these people? Because I think one of the issues that we're running into is it's really hard to hear those voices because they don't know what's available to them. And so how do we make it more known, what is available, how can people engage, how can people interact, even if they don't have the math background or the modeling background? So I'll start with Mark and then Leslie.
And just to say, what you guys are doing in developing coalitions and partnerships, I think is just critical, and kudos for that. It's absolutely needed. So we were really surprised, to be quite honest. In a former life, I used to work for a specialized UN agency, and my task was to go along, work with governments, be embedded in governments, in least developed countries in particular, and just to help them get their planning systems structured a little bit better. And you always found some of the brightest people that were absolutely overworked and just had a very difficult time deciphering from, people, donors knocking on the door saying, you got to do this, versus actually getting access to what it is that they wanted. And many countries didn't want to have finance for wind or for a set of other things that were there. I mean, ultimately, yes, that's important. But what many countries wanted to do is to have ownership of their planning capacity, because many don't. So this was a thing that was a bit surprising. The Energy Modeling Platform for Africa, we teamed up with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which is well linked with all of the governments in the region. And essentially, an ask went out to governments, do you want to have the capacity to do this kind of energy planning? And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I mean, finance. You need energy planning to do finance. Lots of these governments know that they need finance. How do you get there? Our schools were oversubscribed. We got the messaging out to the right circles in governments. Almost every director general in an energy ministry knows that this is something critical. And it was a little bit, it was a bit humbling. We had somebody from the DRC in one occasion, who was not well off, fund themselves to come to the school. So we could find funding for a number of people from some of the organizations I mentioned earlier, and that was wonderful. But we got to a funding limit, and the demand was that high. I just think that maybe we're not always looking in the right sort of channels. I'd have no idea that this was a demand unless I'd been working inside of those governments. But the flip to that, which is also interesting, is you've got the governments, which I think are essential and urgent, and we've got to do stuff now. But then there are also universities. So the schools are split between government analysts and up-and-coming academics. And the academics, they have to get a letter from their dean and motivate why they're going to, incorporate this into their curricula and other things. But the thing is there you've got an interesting space of people that can create the capacity and the community inside of government. And there's a nice link there as well. The government analysts are almost always looking for people to do legwork and analysis. And if they can do that with a master's student or a PhD student from a university, it's neat. The university has some sort of impact measure, which all universities want. And the government actually gets people to give them a bit of breathing space so they can create the bandwidth to engage. And again, we're a small set of UK universities. We would like to band up with other universities and like-minded organizations so that we can create partnerships. I mean, we got an email from the Minister of Energy from Sierra Leone, plus the head of the university the other day saying, look, will you please help us set up an energy center in the university to be able to do some of this analysis that we need? Because we need it for ourselves. We love working with these international organizations, but we need our internal capacity. And it was a bit, again, it's humbling seeing that kind of demand articulated so clearly, but also terrific, because I think there's quite a clear target that would be useful. And as funds are something that needs to be released on the one hand, and people don't know how to ask, and on the other, you've got this huge movement of capital to invest in the energy sector. You've got some strong incentives there, I think.
And so Dr. Howells spoke really amazingly about how we can seek out people who aren't kind of central to this modeling community and bring them in. I think the work that we do in energy systems analysis at CATF is really complementary to that. Because on one hand, we work with people who are central to this effort to help expand the way they think about modeling and change their own efforts so that they can help reach out to others and make the community more inclusive. And on the other hand, our work seeks to make everybody have access to energy models and the designing the pathways that come out of that. And so while maybe not everyone knows what the challenges of renewable energies are or of any other technology, what they do know are the things that they care about. And so if they instead can think about what do I want to happen to the land around me? Or what do I want my own future to look like for me and my family? Then they can use those values to build out the energy pathways that the models show.
Thank you both so much. And so kind of shifting a little bit more towards the technical side of things, I know, Leslie, you've been working on developing some of these like post-processing tools that take the modeling results and kind of put them into a separate mini model or tabletop model or something similar like a tool. Could you describe a little bit more about, what kind of tools that you're working on? What are the benefits of using these types of tools? And then also, Mark, if you have anything similar outside of just, pure optimization or modeling to generate alternatives, what other tools might be helpful to facilitate this type of conversation that we're talking about?
Yeah. One of the components of our work at Clean Air Task Force and Energy Systems Analysis that I'm most excited about is how we translate these modeling results into things that people can use and help have a conversation that's facilitated at the speed at which people are talking and engaging with each other. And so when we're making plans about our energy pathways, everything is about a trade-off and a compromise. And so what we want to show is how we can build these pathways using the values that people have. And so we've created a tool using simulations that can show all different types of locations for where our energy technologies can be developed. And we use those locations to help quantify the impact of each one of those along different metrics. And so during a conversation with different stakeholders, one group might say that they care most about land use and they want to limit development on high conservation areas to a certain level. And another group might say that they care a lot about building transmission and they want to limit the amount of new transmission that has to be built so that we can make it more of a feasible transition. And this tool allows you to see how compatible these different trade-offs are and where different co-benefits might be so that during this live conversation, we can facilitate different pathways that are aligned with different values and trade-offs.
Yeah, just to say that's absolutely critical. So at a different level, I think one of the issues is being able to translate these messages to different communities. It was nicely put there, some people have no idea what their electricity tariff is, but they know what their monthly bill is, right? In the same way, the finance industry doesn't really care about, where you're going to put your power plant and other things. They want to know the rate of return, the risk, who's holding the risk, and how to structure this in a sensible way. The energy ministry will often be worried about the structure of the energy system and can you keep the lights on? And the environment ministry will be coming often to the COP saying, these are the targets that we want to hit. Now, each one of those groups, they require different information. It's a lot of the same analytics or complementary analytics based on some modeling that's there. And, something that's really quite damning for, I think, the modeling community in a way is that we really don't go out of our way to communicate to the stakeholders that matter. Often that's because of resources. You're working really hard to get your next IPCC model run out, and you've got limited time to do anything but that. But actually, in a perfect world, we would be doing our analysis so that it speaks immediately to the finance industry and it sends strong signals there, as well as immediately to the people who are going to inherit the impacts of the energy technologies that are there. So these sorts of dashboards, it's much more than a dashboard. There's stuff that goes on underneath that that enable translation quickly are important. I'll give one little anecdote, and that is, in the past, I would do a lot of consulting work for the World Bank. The World Bank would be looking at assisting a country in thinking about its ambition or other things. So I take one of these models, run it, develop some scenarios, we'd have some stakeholder workshops and so on. And that was great. I mean, it was useful. But it's the case that you kind of have to go further. In Costa Rica, who we've been working with for a while, we co-developed, they did the development. We supported them when they developed it. A modeling system that could automatically talk to the political process as well as the financing. And so from this open, transparent system, from which they did some robust decision analysis and so on, they were able to leverage some of the readiness funds from the Green Climate Fund I was talking about a moment ago, as well as project preparation funds from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. But they also pull this into the political process. When people are, when there are elections and so on, and they're talking about investments in energy, they refer to this system that's been set up because people can see it easily. And I think that's where we need to go. I think it's really, really important. So kudos for doing this work.
And so I'll just kind of close by saying thank you both so much for this, surprise panel at the end of the event. And also just to say, for those of you who are interested in kind of following the thread of this type of work and are interested in engaging in modeling and how we're trying to change this narrative, change this conversation, we hope to kind of continue this conversation and further workshops and events and blogs. So be sure to keep up with that with Professor Howells and Leslie and the Energy Systems Analysis team. So thank you both so much, and thank you all for attending.